His name was Obinna. He was born during the long rains, on a night when thunder cracked the sky and lightning lit the village like fire. From the start, something seemed different. His mother knew it before the midwife did. When he didn't cry, when he didn't flinch at the drums, when his eyes stared too long at moving mouths but never followed their sound. Obinna was deaf. The healer said he was cursed. The neighbors said he was broken. But his mother, Ajua, wrapped him in cloth, kissed his forehead, and whispered stories into ears that never heard her. By the time he was 6, the village had given him a name, Obinna the Hollow. Not out of cruelty, they said, just truth. He didn't laugh. He didn't speak. And worst of all, he didn't listen. Children mocked him openly. They'd mouth fake words and watch him frown. They'd bang sticks behind him and laugh when he didn't turn. Teachers refused to take him in. Even the elders looked at him like an empty pot, useful only if it echoed something back. But Obinna had his own world. He wandered through the village barefoot, his eyes always watching. He saw the way people moved, how they touched their faces when lying, how their hands curled when scared. He watched shadows, watched fire, watched lips. And though he could not hear words, he learned meaning. One day, a boy pushed him near the well. Obinna fell, his hand scraping against stone. Blood trickled from his palm, but he did not cry. He stood, looked the boy in the eyes, and smiled. Not because he liked the pain, but because he knew something. He knew he was not weak. And one day, they would know it too. As the seasons passed, Obinna remained silent, but the village grew louder. The chief's son began training boys for hunting. He refused to let Obinna join. "He won't hear danger," he said. "He'll die before the spear leaves your hand." The others laughed, but Obinna didn't flinch. He watched them instead, how they held the spear, how they missed the mark, how they moved too fast and breathed too loud. At night, he practiced alone, by the river, in the trees, throwing stones at leaves, sharpening sticks against rock. He mimicked the movements of the strongest warriors, not their words, not their shouting, but the quiet parts, the balance, the rhythm, the calm before the strike. He also watched the animals, how they moved before the rain, how birds took off seconds before thunder, how the goats refused water from the well days before it turned sour. Obinna didn't need to hear danger. He felt it, but the village didn't see that. They only saw his silence. One evening, while walking home, he saw a group of boys surrounding an old woman. She had spilled her basket of yams, and instead of helping, they mocked her, making gestures they thought were funny, imitating Obinna's blank face. He stepped in. One boy pushed him. The others laughed. Obinna didn't strike back. Instead, he reached down, picked up the yams, handed them to the woman, and walked away. The boys stood still, unsure why the silence suddenly felt heavier than their laughter. That night, the old woman came to Obinna's home. She brought a carved necklace, old, chipped, worn smooth by time. She pressed it into his hand. "My son wore this," she signed, slowly, trembling. He couldn't hear either. Obinna looked at her, eyes wide. The world had always been loud, but now he wasn't alone in the quiet. The signs came slowly. First, the wind stopped blowing. Days passed without a single breeze, and the leaves hung like dead weight in the trees. Then the birds vanished. Not all at once, just a little less song each morning. The air grew thick, still, too still. The elders called it a silence before something terrible. But Obinna had felt it long before they spoke. He noticed the goats refusing to graze on the eastern side of the village. He saw termites fleeing from beneath the ground, moving in chaotic, spiraling patterns. He felt tremors in the soil when he stepped barefoot. And one night, as he lay awake staring at the ceiling, he saw the shadows flicker, though no fire burned. Something was coming, but no one listened when he tried to tell them. He didn't have words, only gestures, shapes drawn in dirt, motions with his hands, but the villagers laughed, as they always had. Some mocked him again, others shrugged him off. "It's just a deaf boy playing shaman," they said. But one person saw the truth. The old woman who had given him the necklace returned. Her eyes were sunken, her skin thin like parchment, but her hands moved fast, deliberate. "I've seen this before," she signed. "Before the fire came to my mother's village, before the earth opened and swallowed the crops." She pointed to the sky. "No stars. That means something old is walking again." Obinna nodded. That night, he climbed to the top of the western hill, alone, quiet, watching. What he saw made his heart pound, not in fear, but in knowing. Far beyond the trees, the grass was moving, but there was no wind. He ran back before dawn. This time, he didn't try to explain. He just began preparing. Because when danger finally arrived, the only one who would be ready was the one they never heard. It started with the dogs. Just before sunrise, they began howling, high, broken, desperate. Then silence. Not one bark after. The villagers found them scattered near the borders, still breathing but paralyzed, eyes wide, teeth bared, frozen like statues. Then the ground cracked. A tremor rolled beneath the village, not enough to knock things over, but strong enough to shake bowls from shelves and wake every sleeping child. The chief summoned the elders, but none had answers. They spoke of offended spirits, of forgotten sacrifices, of bad omens ignored. But all their stories ended the same way, with fire. By midday, the air smelled like iron. Chickens refused to leave their coops. The sun dimmed, not with clouds, but something thicker. And from the eastern tree line came a sound no one could explain. It wasn't a roar, it wasn't a scream. It was breathing, loud, rhythmic, wet. The bravest of the hunters gathered with spears. They stood near the center of the village, shaking but trying not to show it. The chief called out for calm. "Whatever comes, we will face it together," he said. But Obinna was not with them. He was alone, by the river, drawing in the sand. Lines, circles, patterns he'd seen in old cloth, things the old woman had shown him, signs of protection, paths of movement. He was preparing, not to fight, but to guide. Because he had seen it the night before. The shape, tall, covered in ash and hide, eyes like burning holes. Its body moved without weight. Its feet didn't touch the ground, and yet every time it exhaled, the trees bent backward. The village didn't know it yet, but the creature wasn't just coming, it had already arrived, and no one heard it, except the boy who couldn't hear at all. The first attack came at dusk. A thick fog rolled in, too fast, too heavy. It swallowed trees, paths, and eventually the huts at the village's edge. People screamed. Shapes moved in the mist. Not human, too tall, too thin. Their arms dragged the ground. Their faces had no mouths. But they devoured sound. The cries of those taken weren't heard. Only silence followed. The hunters threw their spears blindly. Some ran. Others collapsed, clutching their heads as if something cold had slithered into their ears. Obinna did not run. He had no sounds to lose, no screams to offer. Instead, he moved. He darted between huts, signaling with his hands, drawing shapes in the dirt, slapping doors 3 times, his code for danger. The old woman followed close behind, repeating his gestures, forcing people inside, locking them in. Then he ran to the center of the village. He dug quickly, hands blistering. The earth was soft from the earlier tremor. He buried 4 small stones, each marked with signs carved in charcoal. Protection symbols, circles to break shadow. He had memorized them from the old cloth. As the fog thickened, one of the creatures emerged, its skin grey and pulsing, its limbs bending the wrong way, its head twitching side to side. The hunters stood frozen. One dropped his blade, another whispered prayers. Obinna stepped forward alone. The creature moved toward him. He didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped into the center of the drawn symbols, lifted the necklace around his neck, and held it out. The carved wood glowed faintly in the fog. The creature hesitated, then screeched, a soundless, vibrating howl that shook dust from the huts. But it didn't cross the circle. Not this one. Because Obinna had drawn it right. He had remembered. He had watched. And now the boy they all mocked was the only one who knew how to stand. The creature circled the drawn symbols, pacing like a lion denied its prey. Its head jerked, sensing the barrier it couldn't cross. Behind Obinna, the villagers watched through cracks and doors, too stunned to cry out, too guilty to look away. The chief staggered forward, face pale, voice trembling. "Why is it not attacking him?" The old woman answered, signing sharply with her fingers. "Because he listens in ways none of you ever did." Obinna didn't turn. He stood still, eyes locked on the creature. Slowly he stepped backward, drawing the monster deeper into the trap. The protection symbols spread outward, circles within circles, each one dug by hand, guided by memory and intuition. The very earth had become his language. More shadows moved in the fog. 3, 5, more, all circling, silent, twitching, and all of them drawn to him. He stepped once more into the final circle, the one he'd marked with blood from his own palm. The creature hesitated. Its form began to twitch harder, glitching like something not meant to be seen. Then Obinna knelt. He placed both hands on the soil. The air vibrated. A low hum began to rise, not sound, but something deeper, a frequency, a pressure. The villagers couldn't hear it, but they felt it in their bones. The creatures stopped moving. Their bodies shook, their forms blurred. The fog thinned just slightly, and then the trees groaned. From within the forest, something older stirred. Not evil, not angry, just ancient, watching, waiting. Obinna closed his eyes. The signs drawn in ash pulsed faintly. The creatures began to retreat, slowly, stumbling back toward the tree line, their forms flickering like candlelight before vanishing completely into the mist. Silence followed, real silence. Not the fearful kind the village once forced on him, but the kind that comes after survival, after clarity. And for the first time, they didn't laugh. They watched. And they listened. When the sun rose, the fog was gone. No bodies, no ashes, no blood, only silence. But this time it wasn't heavy. It wasn't fearful. It was full. The kind of silence that follows a storm. The kind that demands attention. Obinna stood in the center of the clearing, dirt on his hands, ash on his face, eyes steady. The villagers emerged one by one, blinking in the light, stunned by the stillness. The hunters ashamed, the chief humbled. Mothers clutched their children. The old woman stood beside Obinna, hands resting gently on his shoulder. For the first time, the chief approached him with open palms. "We should have listened," he said slowly, mouthing every word. Obinna watched his lips. He nodded, but said nothing. Because it wasn't words that mattered anymore. It was what they chose to do next. The elders gathered. They knelt, not to worship him, not to beg, but to honor. They drew the same symbols he had carved, learning from the traces left in the dirt. They asked the old woman to teach them the hand language they had long ignored. And Obinna? He walked through the village, no longer with his head down. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Children followed him. The same ones who once mocked him now watched in awe as he showed them how to feel vibration in the soil, how to see danger in shadows, how to hear without ears. His silence became their wisdom. In time, the village changed, no longer ruled by noise, no longer afraid of quiet. They planted trees around the old circle. They built a shrine, not with idols, but with signs, drawings, marks, a language born in stillness. And whenever someone new asked, who protected this place, they'd point to a boy sitting near the river, sketching circles in the mud, smiling softly as the wind moved through the grass. The one who heard what none of us could, they'd say. Years passed. The story of that night became legend, but not the kind carved in stone. It lived in gestures, in eyes that lingered, in children taught to pause before they speak. The village no longer mocked silence. They honored it, because they knew now, not all power shouts. Some powers just watch. Obinna never left. He built his own small hut near the edge of the forest, not out of exile, but choice. He liked the stillness there, the movement of trees, the pulse of the earth beneath his feet. People came to him not for noise, but for clarity. Hunters sought his advice before they entered the bush. Mothers brought their sons to learn how to listen, not with ears, but with attention. They called him many things: whisper-born, shadow reader, the one who never spoke, but always knew. I hope you enjoyed the story. If you did, please give the video a like, share what you learned in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more enchanting tales like this one. Thank you for being part of the journey.